So my first 10 properties that I wholesaled were tenant occupied properties, and about 85% of all the properties that I've wholesaled to date are tenant occupied properties. And at this point in my wholesaling career, I would say that the most difficult part about wholesaling a property is navigating tenants that are in the properties that you are trying to wholesale. So in this video, I'm going to break down everything that I've learned about how to sell tenant occupied properties so that you can close your wholesale deals. Check it out. So the very first thing you always need to do is get the tenant information on the front end when you're talking to the seller. Here are the 4 things that I always get on the front end. Number 1, is there a copy of the lease, period? Do they have any copy of the lease? Number 2, do they have a copy of a ledger? A ledger meaning, do they have any list or can they show you any proof that that tenant has been paying rent? The third thing is the lease active or is it expired? And the fourth one is it a Section 8 renter or is it just a regular renter? The reason this is so important is twofold. Number 1, all of your buyers on the back end are always going to want detailed tenant information before they pull a trigger on a property that you're wholesaling. And number 2, I've made this mistake. If you get down the road and you are about to sell a property to an end buyer and you don't have all the details on the front end, this could cause your deals to blow up. I almost lost the biggest deal of my life the day of closing because I didn't have sufficient details on the front end of the lease information. The second thing you need to do, and this is where you're gonna figure out what kind of deal you're about to wholesale, is figure out if the seller is open to having the property vacant at closing or if they are not open to that. So you might go to a seller and ask them if they are willing to have the property vacant at closing so that you can close on the property vacant. Some of them will say yes, but some of them will say no. If they say no, you know that you're going to be wholesaling a property that is tenant occupied, which means that your end buyer needs to be the kind of buyer that is willing to take on the risk and willing to deal with the tenant after the property has already been sold, AKA that's the buyer's problem. Now, I will say that selling tenant occupied properties to end buyers is more difficult because a lot of people don't want to take on the risk or the headache of adopting a tenant. However, if you are working with a seller that is willing to work with you to vacate the property so you have a vacant property at closing, there's 2 things that I think you can do at this point. The first thing that I always do is ask the seller if they are willing to give the tenant a 30-day notice or if they're willing to let the tenant know, hey, I'm selling the property, you'll need to be out on X date. If that's the case, that's perfect because you don't have to come out of pocket or pay the tenant anything. It's in the agreement, the seller's ready to sell, they want the tenant out, and you can close on that deal. That's the easiest way to do that. However, if the seller isn't comfortable with that, or if you want to make sure that the tenant is out of the property and you want to incentivize the tenant, you can do a cash for keys program. I call it a cash for keys program. It's simply cash for keys, and it's exactly what it sounds like. You are going to pay the tenant a sum of cash to give you the keys of the property and leave the property. There are several different situations that I've come across with the cash for keys program that makes all parties feel like they're winning. I'll break down a few of those. Number 1, most commonly, is the seller has a personal relationship with the tenant or wants to make sure that the tenant doesn't feel like they're getting kicked out of the property. So you use a cash for keys program to help the tenant move on to their next property. So maybe you cover half of the security deposit for their next place, or maybe you just give them a lump sum to say, hey, I'm asking you to leave the property, but here's some financial help so that when you move on, you feel like you have something that you are getting in return for leaving the property. The second situation, and this situation happens more often than not, almost all of your buyers are going to want a vacant property. So the cash for keys program is something where, number 1, you can get the tenant out faster than you would if they had no incentive. And number 2, you get to typically have a better deal and actually ask a little bit more for the property if it's vacant at closing. So these are different situations where the cash for keys program, you don't necessarily have to do it, but if you do implement this and you have a vacant property at closing, there's a good chance that you're gonna get a better price from your end buyer and that your end buyer is going to be happy, and also it helps the tenant incentivizes the tenant to move on more quickly. This is my third piece of advice. If you got to the point where your seller is comfortable working a cash for keys program with the tenant, you need to figure out how much you want to offer that tenant to vacate the property. In my experience, the amount that you offer the tenant in a cash for keys program is directly correlated to either the value of the property or the value that you have in this deal. For example, the majority of my cash for keys programs start out at about $500, but I have paid up to several $1,000s to ask a tenant to leave the property. Now, let's say you've coordinated with the seller and the tenant that you are willing to give that tenant $1,000 to leave the property on a certain date. Here are the details that I would give you at this point. The first thing I'd say is make sure you have this documented and written down. This is going to be a contract that you sign with the tenant in order to implement this program. The details of this agreement that are important are obviously how much you're willing to pay the tenant, when you're going to pay the tenant. So I always pay the tenant the day of closing, or maybe it's the day before closing to verify that the property is vacant. And then the last thing is that the property needs to be delivered in as is good condition. The time that you walk the property to the time that you go and take the keys from the tenant and exchange the cash, that property needs to be in exactly the same condition. The reason this is important is because there have been horror stories of people implementing cash for keys programs, and then you go walk the property the day of closing and they've destroyed the property, maybe because they're angry at you or they didn't want to move or just out of vengeance. So if you have in your documentation, in your contract with the tenant, that the only way this contract is valid is if the property is delivered in good condition, then you aren't stuck paying this tenant $1,800 or $1,000 in this case to leave the property, but they've left you a destroyed property. So make sure you have a contract with the tenant when you implement this program. So if you didn't pick up on this on the way, the final step is you actually make a date where you go to the property either the day of closing or the day before closing with a check in hand. I usually don't use cash because carrying that much cash can be dangerous. Have a check in hand, have the contract in hand for the tenant to sign. You go walk the property, a 5-minute walkthrough, make sure everything is the same. That's when you sign the contract, you give the tenant the capital, you take the keys, you make sure the door's locked, and then you have a vacant property. Hopefully you're closing that day or the next day. That is how the Cash for Keys program works. So I personally have done several deals up to this point where the seller agrees to vacate the tenant and it costs me nothing. And I've also had several deals where I pay the tenant a Cash for Keys program. More often than not, I like to do the Cash for Keys program because it helps me be efficient to get the tenant out. The tenant is happy leaving, and it just feels safer once you're getting in there, you're getting the property vacant. Everyone feels like they win. I personally love this program. I would just be very careful of not offering too much on the front end. Offer enough that you think is fair to get the tenant out of the property and help the tenant move on, but also don't gouge your margins by giving the tenant way too much money. At the end of the day, you're a wholesaler, you're a problem solver, you have to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Do what you need to do to get the deal closed. I hope this video helped. Go crush some tenant occupied deals. We'll catch you on the next one.